The lawyer's office smelled like stale coffee and old paper, the kind of scent that lingers in the corners of places where secrets go to die. I sat there on the edge of a leather chair that squeaked every time I shifted, the same chair I'd sat in 5 years ago when we'd signed the first draft of the will. Back then, my husband had squeezed my hand so hard my knuckles cracked, his eyes soft but stubborn, as if he knew this day would come sooner than either of us wanted to admit. I should have been prepared. He'd fought that sickness with everything he had, the appointments, the pills that turned his skin gray, the nights he'd ask me to read him the same old book until the words blurred on the page. He'd held on longer than the doctors predicted, longer than his mother liked to tell people when she needed to remind them what a fighter her boy was. And now, he was gone, and all that was left was a manila folder on the lawyer's polished desk, his name typed in neat black letters that felt too cold to touch. I barely heard the lawyer's voice. Something about the house, mine, of course. The car, paid off. His savings, modest but enough to keep me from drowning while I figured out what came next. I nodded at all the right parts, murmured a polite thank you when the lawyer paused to ask if I had any questions. But my eyes kept drifting back to the corner of the folder where a small envelope sat, sealed shut with a smear of wax. My name was on it, in his handwriting, that quick slant he always used when he left notes on the fridge. Back soon. Love you more than coffee. The lawyer hesitated before sliding it across the table. He left this with the instructions that it was for you alone. I wasn't to open it, and neither was anyone else. I took it with both hands, the paper softer than I expected, the weight of it so light but so heavy all at once. I wanted to tear it open right there, to hear his voice in my head one last time, to see what words he'd saved for after the world fell silent around him. But I didn't. Not yet. His mother was waiting in the lobby. I could feel her eyes through the frosted glass, the way she'd stared at me at the funeral like I'd done something unspeakable just by surviving him. I signed the last of the documents, my pen scratching across the paper while the lawyer droned on about paperwork and certificates. All I could see in my mind was the envelope in my bag, hidden like a secret no one else could touch. The idea that he'd written something just for me was a mercy I hadn't expected. He'd said everything that mattered, I'd thought. I'd sat by his bed as he took his final breath, my hand pressed to his chest, my ear against his heartbeat until it stuttered and stilled. I'd thought that was the end of the story we'd written together. It wasn't. When I finally stepped out into the hallway, his mother was there, perched on the lobby couch like a crow waiting for something shiny to snatch. She didn't stand up when she saw me, just narrowed her eyes at the folder in my hands. Did he remember to put down the family plot? She asked. Her voice was too sweet, like poison candy. You know he'd want to be with his father. All of us together. I held the envelope tighter against my side, feeling the faint scratch of his handwriting through the paper. I gave her a smile I'd practiced for years, the polite mask I wore whenever she talked about what's best for everyone. I'll let you know, I said, my voice calm, steady. She didn't see the letter. She didn't see that, for the first time in all these years, he'd left me with something that belonged to me alone, a truth that didn't have room for her version of family. I walked out of that office into the sharp winter air, the envelope tucked close to my heart. I didn't know yet what it would say. But deep down, in the quiet place he'd always kept just for me, I already felt it. This wasn't going to end the way they expected. I didn't open it in the car. I thought I would, that I'd sit behind the wheel in the parking lot, the heater rattling warm air at my numb hands while his words spilled out across the console. But when I climbed inside and shut the door, the envelope felt too sacred for that. Too real. Too final. It was one thing to know he'd gone. It was another to hold the last thing he'd ever say to me in my hands. So I drove home instead. The road looked the same as it had every day for the past 15 years, the same cracked yellow lines, the same faded billboards for diners I never stopped at, the same winter branches clawing at the sky like they were trying to scrape a hole in the clouds. He'd ridden beside me on this road 1,000 times, humming off-key to old songs on the radio, tapping his fingers on his knee like the world wasn't ending inside him. I thought about all the things we'd said to each other in this car, the promises, the arguments, the apologies. How he'd always squeezed my hand at red lights, like he needed to be sure I was still real. At home, the house was too quiet. The air felt heavy, the way it does when you come back from a funeral and realize the silence has been waiting for you all along. I left my coat on, sat down at the kitchen table, our table, the one he'd built himself one summer when we had more time than money. I traced the scratches on the wood with my thumb, the ghost of his laughter in every groove. The envelope lay in the center of the table. Just paper. Just ink. But it might as well have been a match, waiting to set everything we'd built on fire. I took a deep breath, slipped my finger under the flap, and broke the seal. His handwriting filled the page, slanted, quick, with tiny corrections where he'd pressed too hard. My eyes blurred on the first line. My love. If you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry for that. I always thought I'd find the right moment to say this out loud, but the right moment never came, maybe because I didn't want you to carry it too soon. I pressed my palm over the paper like I could feel the warmth of his voice in the ink. I need you to know something, because it matters more than anything my mother, my brother, or anyone else will tell you. I don't want to be buried with them. I don't want their family plot, their granite marker with my name squeezed in next to people who never made room for you. They pretended to accept you, but you and I both know they never did. You were always her to them, never my wife. But you were my everything. You still are. The words bent and twisted in front of me, heavy as wet rope. Remember that place we found on our anniversary? The hills upstate with the wildflowers and that old fence line? The place we said we'd buy land someday when we got brave enough to leave the city? That's where I want to be. Ashes scattered, or a simple stone under the trees, I don't care how you do it. I just want it to be you. No speeches from people who never loved me the way you did. No fake tears. No mother controlling every word while pretending you don't exist. I pictured that hillside, the way the wind blew so hard we could barely hear each other, how he'd kissed my forehead and called it our someday. I'd laughed then, called him a dreamer. He'd smiled like he was carving it into his bones. And now, here he was, asking me to keep that promise when he wasn't here to hold my hand through the storm. They'll fight you. They'll say you forged this. They'll make you feel small. Don't let them. This is the last thing I'm asking you for. Let me rest with you. Let me stay where we were happy. I love you more than I ever said. I'm sorry it took leaving for me to say this right. Yours. Always. When I finished, my tears left a ring on the paper. I folded it, pressed it flat, tucked it against my chest like a heartbeat. Outside, the wind rattled the window. I knew they'd come for me soon, for him, really. But I also knew something I hadn't known when I walked into that lawyer's office. I was going to bury him where he asked. And they would never see it coming. They didn't wait long. By the next morning, his mother was on my porch, the familiar knock that always came too hard, too sharp, like she owned every door her son had ever walked through. I watched her through the sheer curtain, that perfect winter coat buttoned up to her throat, her lips pressed into a line that never quite softened, even when she called me dear in front of other people. I opened the door just enough for the cold to slip in with her perfume. She didn't ask to come in. She pushed past me like she always did, stepping into the kitchen, her eyes flicking across the counters as if expecting to find my grief folded up in neat piles she could rifle through. I spoke to the funeral director this morning, she said. Not how are you? Not I know you miss him. Just that. A command disguised as information. I said nothing. I wanted to watch her talk, to see how she spun this so fast, how she held the reins even now. She opened her handbag, pulled out a folded pamphlet from the family plot, the one with the shaded diagram of where his father, his grandparents, even the baby brother he'd never spoken about, were all buried. There's a space beside his father. It's the right place for him. We need to schedule the burial for next Saturday. Her eyes finally met mine, cold, calculating, like she was searching my face for cracks. You do have the ashes, don't you? I could feel the letter in my pocket, its creased edges soft from where I'd run my thumb over his words all night. He didn't want that, I said, my voice steady, though my heart thundered so loud I thought she might hear it. She tilted her head, that practiced pity dripping from her chin like venom. Of course he did, dear. It's his family plot. He'd want to be with us. Where else would he go? I pulled out the letter, laid it on the kitchen table. Her eyes narrowed, reading the first lines, his words, clear as daylight, telling her no. Telling me yes. He asked me for something different, I said. He wants to be in the hills. Away from all this. Away from the fighting. Her laugh startled me, sharp and bitter. You really expect anyone to believe that? That you didn't write this yourself? He never told me that. He would have told me. She said me like a promise she thought she could still collect. As if his love for her outranked everything else, even when he lay in a box she hadn't bought, in a suit she'd chosen to show him off one last time. He told me, I said. In this. That's enough for me. Her voice dropped then, soft as a blade sliding between ribs. People will think you're disrespecting his legacy. They'll think you've lost your mind. You want to be the wife who couldn't even bury her husband properly? That's what they'll remember. I thought of all the times she'd stood at my kitchen counter, listing the things I'd done wrong, the wrong dinner, the wrong wine, the wrong jokes. How he'd take my hand under the table, squeeze it 3 times, our secret way of saying I'm here. Ignore her. This was the last squeeze. His last way of saying ignore her. Do what I asked. Do what we wanted. I don't care what they remember, I said, my voice so calm it startled me. I care about him. And I care about what he wanted. You can call your lawyers, your church friends, the newspaper if you want. I'm not putting him in that ground beside people who couldn't stand me. He chose me. He chose us. Her hands trembled as she folded the pamphlet back into her bag. You'll regret this, she hissed. You're nothing without this family. I watched her walk out my door, the echo of her heels on the porch like nails tapping on a coffin that would never hold him. I slipped my hand into my pocket, felt the letter again, warm against my skin, like a heartbeat reminding me that sometimes love means saying no. And I was just getting started. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table until the sun slipped behind the trees, the light turning the letter in my hand to gold, then gray, then something I could barely see but could still feel, pulsing like a promise under my fingertips. The house felt too big without him, every corner echoing with the things he'd left behind. His coat on the hook by the door. The old boots he'd meant to toss but never did. His favorite mug on the drying rack, the one I couldn't bring myself to wash yet, like his fingerprints might still be there, waiting for me to press mine against them. I'd always thought grief would be loud, though wailing, tearing at hair, throwing plates against the wall just to hear something break. But it wasn't like that. It was quiet, a hum behind my ribs that said he's gone, but you're not. So what will you do now? What I did was simple. I pulled out the old box from the closet, the one he called his someday box, full of maps, scribbled notes, clippings of land for sale in places we could never quite afford. The hill he'd written about in the letter was there, tucked between pages of ideas for garden plots and sketches of a cabin he swore he'd build himself. He'd always been a dreamer. I'd spent years trying to keep him tethered to the real world, the bills and the work shifts and the mother who sniffed at every plan that didn't come with a family name carved into stone. But now, he'd handed me the dream. No more excuses. No more second guessing. I spread the maps across the table. Found the old photos we'd taken that weekend, the 2 of us standing on that hill, our cheeks red from the wind, his arm wrapped around my shoulder so tight you'd think he knew he'd never get to stand there again. I traced the ridge line with my finger, remembered the way the grass had whispered around our feet, how he'd pointed to the spot by the old fence and said, "Here. This is where I'd want to lay my head down for good. Just you and me and the sky." I could still hear him say it. I could still feel him standing behind me, warm breath on my neck, his chin on my shoulder. It made my eyes sting, but it made my spine straighten too. Because that was the part his mother would never understand. I didn't keep him in my life by accident. I fought for every bit of him they tried to claim. Every choice we made together was a fight she never saw because he'd always handled her, always stepped in front of her barbed words like a shield so I wouldn't have to bleed. And now it was my turn. I didn't tell anyone my plan. I didn't answer calls, not from his mother, not from the cousins who suddenly remembered my number when they smelled a scandal. I let them spin their stories in living rooms that had never felt like home to me anyway. Let them call me selfish, disrespectful, a wife who didn't know her place. If they wanted to gossip about me, they could do it around that empty hole in the family plot they thought they could fill with him like he was theirs to keep. I knew better. That night, I folded the letter and slipped it into the inside pocket of my coat. I packed a small bag of warm clothes, the box of maps, the cheap travel urn the funeral home had tried to upcharge me for until I'd looked them dead in the eye and said, he didn't care about fancy. I stood in our bedroom doorway for a long time before I turned off the light. It wasn't a goodbye. Just a promise that the next time I said his name out loud, it would be in the wind he loved, on the hill he chose, not in the cold shadow of people who'd never loved him the way I did. They'd try to stop me. They'd say he deserved better than some unmarked patch of earth where only I would visit. But they'd be wrong. He deserved to rest exactly where he felt free. And this time, I'd be the one to carry him there. The morning I left with him, the sky was the same pale gray it had been the day we first stood on that hill and called it ours. I think he would have liked that, the hush before the sun really rises, the road empty enough to feel like it belongs to you alone. No curious neighbors peering through curtains. No mother-in-law with her tight mouth and sharper words, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. I'd planned every mile the night before. I knew they'd try to follow if they found out, call the lawyer, call the police maybe, tell them I'd stolen him like I'd stolen their perfect funeral with the polished headstone beside people who'd spent more time judging him than loving him. But they didn't know me like he did. They'd never bothered to look that close. I drove with both hands on the wheel, the small travel urn wrapped in the old flannel shirt he always wore in the garden. I kept it strapped into the passenger seat like he was riding along, humming his tone-deaf songs, tapping his fingers against the window when the view got pretty enough to pull him out of his head. Every few miles I'd glance over, half expecting him to wink at me and say, "You're doing good, honey. Keep going." The hills came into view right past the old county line. There was no sign marking them, just a break in the trees and a narrow dirt road winding up like a question you couldn't answer from the bottom. I pulled off onto the shoulder and killed the engine. For a moment I sat there in the hush, letting the quiet press against my chest. I thought about how this was exactly the kind of place he loved, wild, a little unkempt, never pinned down by fences or tidy rows. When I stepped out, the wind bit at my cheeks, but I didn't flinch. I'd packed his favorite blanket in my bag, the one he used to drag out for picnics, pretending the ants wouldn't find us no matter how many times I told him they always did. I spread it out on the grass near the old fence line, just like he'd sketched in the someday box. The ground was soft here, the earth forgiving. It felt right that it should welcome him back. I held the urn in my hands for a long time before I opened it. My fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of every promise he'd asked me to keep. The letter crinkled in my pocket like a heartbeat. Let me rest where we were happy. Not where they could stand over him with rehearsed tears and polished shoes, telling stories about a son who'd never been good enough for them. Here, he could just be him. No legacy. No family name chiseled in granite to claim what they'd never earned. The ashes caught the wind as soon as I tipped the urn. For a second I panicked, afraid they'd blow back at me, that I'd fail him even now. But the breeze carried him gentle, careful, across the grass and into the wildflowers poking up stubborn through the frost. I watched them settle under the old fence line, the same place he'd pointed to when we were young and hopeful and planning a future too big to fit into the family plot. When it was done, I sat on the blanket for a while, my knees pulled to my chest. I talked to him the way I always did when he'd work late in the garden, humming back to the house after dark. I told him I was sorry it had taken me this long to see what he'd been trying to show me all along, that home isn't a name on a stone or a plot someone else says you've earned. It's where you're finally free to be known for who you are, not who they want you to be. I pressed my palm to the soft dirt, felt the earth take him in like it had been waiting. I knew they'd never forgive me for this. I also knew I'd never regret it. I stayed on that hill until the sun dipped low enough to turn the wildflowers gold. The blanket was damp from the frost melting beneath me, but I didn't care. I wanted to feel it, the way the wind danced across my skin, the way the earth seemed to breathe with him settled into it now. It felt alive in a way the family plot never did. No marble markers here. No rows of polite, cold stone. Just grass, stubborn and wild, refusing to be tamed. I read the letter again. The words had softened at the edges, creases worn thin from where I'd folded and unfolded them too many times to count. Each line felt like him sitting beside me, knees bent, hands tugging at the collar of his flannel like he always did when he felt shy about big feelings. Let me rest with you. Let me stay where we were happy. He'd trusted me with this when he didn't trust anyone else. That trust was worth more than any name etched on granite. When I finally stood, my legs were stiff, but my mind was clear. I knew what would happen next, the calls, the threats, the carefully worded letters from family lawyers who would pretend to care about what he wanted while making sure their family story stayed tidy and proper. They'd say I was disrespectful. That I'd stolen him away twice, once in life, once in death. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had stolen him from them. But the thing they never understood was that you can't steal what was never really theirs to begin with. They'd clung to the name, the bloodline, the plot of land that made them feel like good people for keeping him close, while pushing him away in every other way that counted. They hadn't loved him when it was hardest. They hadn't held his shaking hands at 3 a.m. when he whispered that he was afraid of dying alone. That had been me. It had always been me. So let them hate me. Let them curse my name in rooms I'd never sit in again. Let them gossip to neighbors and clutch their pearls about the scandal of it all. I could live with that. What I couldn't live with was burying him in a place where he'd feel as unseen in death as he sometimes felt in life. Back in town, the calls started before I'd even put my bag down. I let them go to voicemail. I didn't need to hear the shrill edge of his mother's voice or the polished legal threats she'd borrowed from a nephew who still owed me an apology for the way he'd whispered about me at our wedding. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't owe them anything. Instead, I made tea. I sat in our kitchen, the light above the stove humming the way it always did when he'd sneak in for a midnight snack. I poured 2 cups, an old habit I didn't want to break yet, and set one across from me. I told him I'd done it. That the hill was exactly how we'd left it, wild and free, stubborn as we were. That the wind had carried him just like he hoped it would. And then I talked about the future. Mine, now. Small things, the garden I'd finally plant out back. The fence I'd fix when the weather turned warm again. Maybe I'd sell the house someday, or maybe I'd stay right here and let the walls remember both of us the way we were, imperfect, honest, ours. The next morning, I took the letter out one last time. I didn't lock it away with the legal papers and the death certificate. I tucked it into the pocket of his flannel, the one I'd washed and hung to dry in the sun. Then I pressed it into a box with the maps and the old sketches of a cabin he'd once dreamed of building. Not an end, just a piece of him, kept safe. When I stepped outside, the wind was crisp and clean, no echo of the voices that used to tell me who I was allowed to be. He was free now. And so was I.